Chapter 33. Dr. Rodney Scott was 6'3" and thin, and in spite of being a veteran of the World War and bald, had a face like a boy's. He bought a new high-powered car every year, spent a third of his life on the Wyoming highways, answering county calls at 90 miles an hour. People said Dr. Scott always went on 2 wheels. Another third of his time was spent on the golf links or fishing in the trout streams that had their headwaters in the snowy range, and the other third doing just whatever was the exactly right thing for a doctor to do in order to save human life and alleviate pain and distress. On this day, which happened to be a Saturday, Rob drove the Studebaker into Cheyenne, picked up the doctor's trail, and hunted him for many hours and many miles. He found him, at last, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, standing in deep consultation on a rock, casting a long line with a gray hackle on the end of it, 40 yards downstream, to a particularly dark streak of water under the shadow of a deep-set rock. It was 2 hours later when the 2 cars, Dr. Scott in one and Rob in the other, roared up the hill behind the ranch house. Ken's condition had been growing steadily worse. In spite of the hot blankets, chills shook him every few minutes until his teeth chattered. His temperature was 103 when Nell put him to bed. By noon, it was 104. Much of the time he slept, or at least, thought Nell, as she sat beside the bed, holding one of his thin, helpless-feeling hands in both of hers, he was in some sort of unconsciousness. She had discovered that his pajamas had never been slept in last night, never unfolded. He had gone to his room at the usual time, but apparently had not undressed. She figured out what had happened. It was Flicka's last night on Earth. Ken had gone down to her when the house was quiet. He had, doubtless, spent the night, just as Gus had found him, holding Flicka in the water. She wondered if the filly was alive or dead. And then came a deeper wonder at the way the lives of the two, boy and filly, seemed intertwined. When Ken roused from his sleep or coma, sometimes he looked at her as if he knew her, sometimes stared at her unknowing. Sometimes he seemed to be listening, turned his head and eyes toward the window, and lay motionless. Listening for her, thought Nell, to hear her nicker, or listening for a shot. The day grew darker and more gloomy. Once there was a sudden sound like the soft rolling of a corps of drums, a mere whisper. Nell went to the window and saw that it was rain. It rolled to a crescendo, then died away in a murmur. Not a minute in all. The sky was massed with low clouds. Standing in the windows, Nell heard the sharp, excited barking of the dogs down in the calf pasture. They had found something. That was the way they yelped when their hunting instinct was aroused. Looking in that direction, she noticed some chicken hawks swinging in the clouds above the 3 pines. She went back to Ken, seated herself on the edge of the bed, and leaned over him, examining his face. It was one of the times where he lay motionless, strained and listening. Was he conscious at all, or dreaming? His eyes were half open. "Kenny," she murmured in a low voice. "Ken, dear." But that was not the sound Ken was listening for, and he did not hear. Every little while, as time went on, there came again the whispering roll of drums, and then the sigh of the rain ceasing. The cure of a patient by a doctor is supposed to begin, they say, when the doctor sets foot in the house. When Nell heard the men's voices below and their steps on the stairs, she experienced an emotion that shook her so strongly that all of her hardihood left her, and she covered her face with her hands for a moment. Then she lifted her head and went to the door to greet them. Ken was tossing and muttering. He did not know the doctor. As Dr. Scott made the examination, he was told what had happened, that Ken's filly was ill, dying, and that Ken had gone down to her late the night before and had apparently been in the water most of the night, holding the horse in his arms. "His school opens Monday, day after tomorrow," said Rob, ending the question. The doctor shook his head, said, "Not a chance," and put the covers back, parting the jacket of Ken's pajamas and loosening the tie of the trousers, baring the narrow brown body, laying his fingers on it and tapping them. "Perhaps by the end of the week?" asked Rob. "Not likely," said Scott cheerfully. "Sometimes children surprise you, blow up something like this, and then get right over it. But his fever is 104. He's got something. I don't know what yet." "An infection?" asked Nell. "Of course. You don't run a fever up like this without an infection somewhere." "Could he have got it from the filly? He's been with her constantly." The doctor shrugged his shoulders as he drew the covers up over Ken. "That is a statement I wouldn't care to make. It's possible. Human beings do catch things from animals. Anthrax, for instance, which can be caught from sheep. But there's tons of influenza around, more in the country than in town, strange to say. Now I've got to get a look at his throat. Maybe he'll help us. Mrs. McLaughlin, you talk to him. They usually hear their mother's voice, even when they're way off." Rob lifted the boy to the right position, and Nell, in the calm and matter-of-fact voice of mothers, which never failed to fill Dr. Scott with humility and respect, talked to Ken and drew him back, step by step, from that far place where he was wandering, to the little familiar room and the walnut bed that was like home to him. He became almost lucid. He opened his mouth and let the doctor look at his throat. "Nothing wrong there," said Scott, and put the child back on his pillows again. Ken's head turned sideways, and again Nell thought he was listening. The doctor sat holding Ken's wrist tightly clasped in his big strong hand and looked at the face on the pillow. For a few minutes there was silence. The room was getting quite dark. Suddenly it was brightly lit by a shimmering of sheet lightning, and the doctor glanced at the window and said, "Gonna have some weather." In the darkness that followed the lightning came a rush and a roar of wind that sucked through the gorge, bent every tree on the hill, and slammed the kitchen door. Nell lit the kerosene lamp, and the doctor stood up and looked down at Ken. The boy's eyes were closed now, and he lay motionless, drawing rapid breaths through dry, parted lips. "He's a very sick boy," said Scott. "What is this? I saw Ken early last spring. What's happened to him this summer? I wouldn't know him for the same boy. It's not only this cold and fever." Nell and Rob looked at each other. It was not an easy question. There was so much to tell. They went downstairs with the doctor, and Rob said, "It's this horse he's been breaking his heart about." The doctor was puzzled. "Has he been sick before this?" "Not sick exactly," said Nell, "but on an awful strain because she's been sick." Scott could see that Nell was anxious to get back to Ken. He put on his things. "I won't keep you, Mother." He called all women Mother. "You want to get back to him. Rob, he's got to have some medicine right away." "I'll follow you into town," said Rob, "and bring it back." He reached for Nell, took her in his arms, and hugged and kissed her. "Now don't worry so, darling. The kid'll be all right." "Of course," said Nell. "I'll go back to him." The doctor gave her some final instructions for Ken's care and went out with Rob.